does the medical community recognize different severities or classifications of traumatic brain injury?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, there's the mild variety, okay, and then it becomes moderate if there's any technological findings. So if there's any findings on MRIs or CT scans, then that injury then is moderate, and severe. Severe usually is the person's in a coma, and there's a measurement of that, your coma status, and so if you're in a coma, that would be severe.
Does mild mean minor?
No, mild does not mean that the consequences could be mild. Okay, mild is specifically, you'll see that we specifically call mild, okay, within a certain parameter. So we look at the accident and we see the parameters of that accident and the person's level of awareness and consciousness at that time. Okay, loss of consciousness is not required for a mild traumatic brain injury. However, if there is a loss of consciousness, even if it's for seconds, okay, then you're automatically a grade 3 concussion. Concussion is just a fancy word for brain injury.
We've heard quite a bit about concussions. We've seen movies. We've heard about football players. We've heard a lot in the popular press and media. Tell us, what are the classic signs and symptoms of a concussion?
Okay, so it could be as simple as the bell rung, or you could have some sort of mental alteration at the time of the incident. So dizziness or headaches or being in a fog, or I think Ms. Williams said blackout, or things went dark. There's just some sort of mental alteration. Now, you understand that people don't know whether they're unconscious or not, right? I mean, if you're unconscious, how do you know it? So if there's a lag time between medical personnel coming to see you in an accident, it could be very well that the person was unconscious, even if they deny it. All right. So we seek to try to understand exactly what happened. But just recent research now has pointed out that it could take up to 14 days for the axons to shear, meaning that the complaints from the individual doesn't have to happen now immediately at the time that the accident happens. It could evolve over time. Bleeds can evolve over time, and that symptomatology can continue. God bless you.
We know more about concussions now than we did 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. But are there still some myths surrounding concussions that you need to talk about here today?
Yes.
Let's talk about those.
All right. So, loss of consciousness being required is a myth. It is now, universally accepted. There was a TBI conference in Zurich, Switzerland in 2012, and the consensus of worldwide individuals say that loss of consciousness is not required. However, if you do lose consciousness, even for seconds, it will be a grade 3. A head strike is not necessary. We know this through various animal studies as well as human studies and all those unfortunates that have been subject to rotational forces when your brain moves back and forward. If you think of a tomato in a jar and that jar is moving along and all of a sudden it stops, that tomato keeps moving. So that brain of yours keeps going, okay, and it keeps slushing around and keeps moving. So you don't have to have an obvious skull fracture or anything like that. Mild does not mean insignificant. That is a myth. There are about 15 to 10% of individuals with mild, quote, mild TBIs that have long-term problems and actually get worse through time because, like anything else, age is always a mediator. So the outcome for a 20-year-old is going to be different than it is for a 60-year-old. All right? And emotional problems are not related. Well, okay, 20 years ago, I've said repeatedly, you have one brain that mediates both. So your emotional problems have physiological components to it. Your cognitive issues have physiological components to it. It's one brain that mediates both. And oftentimes people with TBIs have both cognitive and emotional and sensory impairments. And normal appearance means everything's okay. When it comes to brain damage individuals, seeing is not believing. You can't tell a content of a book by looking at its cover. So seeing is not believing, and so you may see someone and say, hey, you know, that person looks okay to me, and they're talking and they're walking and they comprehend what you're asking them. And there are specific neuropsychological reasons why a person may look okay. For example, we know that in any brain situation, unless you damage that language center, because it's overlearned and you use language continuously, that area is called a hold function, H-O-L-D. It retains its value. And so if you talk to a brain damaged person, they may be able to comprehend what you're saying, and they respond back, and you may say, okay, everything is fine with them. But that's only one part of your brain. And we actually use those whole functions for baseline analysis.
So, doctor,